Subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. I welcome all of you to this hearing today, which is the topic is the right to self-defense. And I now recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I thank the gentleman, and now I will recognize myself for an opening statement. Again, thank you, everyone here who's here today. I'm pleased to chair the hearing we have before us, focusing on the Second Amendment and the right to self-defense. The Second Amendment protects our rights to keep and bear arms, which includes both firearms and knives. The Supreme Court's landmark decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin held that the Second Amendment protects the right to carry a handgun for self-defense outside the home, not just inside the home, as the court held in Heller. At a time when violent crime continues to plague our communities and rogue prosecutors allow criminals back out on the streets, now more than ever, it is important to preserve our right to defend ourselves and our loved ones. It's disgraceful to think someone protecting their family from a deadly attack could be punished for defending their family. Unfortunately, my colleagues across the aisle do not share these same views. Instead of passing legislation to keep criminals off the streets, former President Joe Biden's ATF sought to achieve far-left policy outcomes through federal agency rulemaking. Former President Biden's ATF promulgated various rules to regulate pistol braces and the frames and receivers on firearms, or so-called ghost guns. Former President Biden's ATF also issued a rule to create several presumptions about when an individual is defined as a dealer in firearms and needs to be licensed as a federal firearms licensee. And instead of continuing long-standing relationships with FFLs, which serve as the first line of defense against criminals, the Biden ATF actually treated FFLs like they were the criminals. These efforts targeted lawful firearm owners and did nothing to prevent actual criminals from committing violent crimes. My colleagues across the aisle fail to realize how more gun control only harms and impacts the vulnerable populations they claim they want to protect. Thankfully, under this new administration, firearms owners and firearms businesses alike can breathe a sigh of relief. The right to self-defense is a cornerstone in our country. Despite what the mainstream media may like you to believe, 38 states have stand-your-ground laws compared to a duty to retreat. However, the current landscape of firearm laws across the country surrounding when and where you carry a firearm are often complex and difficult to navigate. To think that a person lawfully owning and carrying a firearm in one state becomes a criminal as soon as they cross into another is completely absurd. Some things need to change. The same confusing landscape of complex criminal laws exists for carrying a knife across state lines. My bill, the Knife Owners Protection Act, would protect the right of law-abiding citizens to transport knives interstate, notwithstanding the burden and patchwork of state and local prohibitions. And I look forward to marking up the Knife Owners Protection Act in this committee. Our committee will continue to stand with FFLs, firearms, and knife owners, and any law-abiding citizen who refuses to become a victim. This week, the two ranking members sent a letter to the Attorney General asking her to refrain from repealing the ATF's unconstitutional regulations. In that letter, they cited a misleading statistic that I'd like to take the time to clarify. They said, quote, "Today there are more gun dealers than there are locations of Starbucks, McDonald's, Dunkin' Donuts, Burger King, Subway, and Chick-fil-A combined," close quote. They justify this statement by citing to a report on the number of active firearm licenses. However, the ranking members mistakenly equate one firearm license to one firearm dealer, as if a single FFL has a retail outlet. In fact, there are only about 25,000 physical addresses for firearms dealers in this country. A single firearms dealer can hold multiple licenses, and someone can have a license without actually being a firearms dealer. That is the fact. And at this time, I'm going to yield back and recognize the ranking member, Ms. McBath, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it. And good morning, and thank you to all of our witnesses that are joining us this morning. Every single day, more than 110 Americans die from gun violence, and more than 110 families have to confront their worst fear, that they have lost a person who means absolutely everything to them. I came to Congress because one of those families was my family. In November 2012, I got the call that no parent should ever have to face, that my son had been taken by gun violence. My son Jordan would now have just celebrated his 30th birthday, and every day I think about the life that he should be living. And I think about the millions of Americans' lives that are lost or changed by preventable gun violence. And I know that I am not alone. For decades, survivors and those who aspire to a safer tomorrow have been working together to bring an end to gun violence. And in June of 2022, after more mass shootings in Uvalde and Buffalo, we passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the first comprehensive gun violence prevention bill in nearly 30 years. For the past 2.5 years, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act has kept guns out of the hands of dangerous people like gun traffickers and domestic abusers. It has invested in improving mental health resources, both in our local schools and throughout all of our communities. It has supported state and local efforts to reduce gun violence, including funding state crisis intervention programs. Since the passage of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, there have been 3,500 fewer murders. That's more than 3,000 families who've never had to receive that devastating news that would change their lives forever. Those are families with a son or daughter who did come home from school, with a mom who did make it back from running an errand or attending a prayer service, or with a dad who did come home after working the late shift. In just 2 years, there are more than 3,000 families who didn't have to face the pain of losing a loved one to murder. The two largest single-year decreases in murder ever recorded. We have the ability to keep this momentum going. And it's not just reducing murder. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act has helped bring violent crime down to an almost 50-year low without infringing on the constitutional rights of a single responsible gun owner or gun seller. Given this incredible progress, it is no wonder that law enforcement supports the work that we have done and the improvements that continue to be made because of this historic law. In 2023, the National Sheriff's Association called on Congress to appropriate $200 million for the Community Violence Intervention and Prevention Initiative, a program that we doubled in size by passing the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. As the sheriff's letter explains, this funding supports law enforcement mentorship, life skills, and vocational training programs. This work is making all of us safer and changing lives for the better, bridging gaps and encouraging trust between law enforcement and the communities that they serve. Similarly, last year, we received a letter from Police Leaders for Community Safety in support of a provision of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that requires those who sell guns predominantly to earn a profit to obtain a license and conduct background checks. Police Leaders for Community Safety explained that this provision prevents felons and other prohibited purchasers from evading background checks and enhances public safety. We know that we're still losing far too many lives to gun violence, violent crime, and suicide. But the solution is clear. We must continue the progress of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and we must build upon it. Our colleagues want to take us back to a time where there were more guns in our communities that might end up in the hands of people who simply should not have them. But we know what is at stake, and that is American lives. At the end of a long day, we all just want our loved ones to come home safely, that our husbands or wives will walk through the door, whether they work in an office, a school, a hospital, or a police precinct. We want to tuck our children into bed each and every single night. We want our moms, our dads, and our best friends to be kept safe from harm and able to speak to us on the other line of a telephone. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act is making sure more people share these important moments together, and that fewer families face the heartbreak when those moments abruptly stop. I once again call on my colleagues to stand with us in working together to end unnecessary gun violence. And before I yield back, I ask unanimous consent to submit into the record a letter from the National Sheriff's Association in support of community violence intervention funding,
Without objection.
and a letter from the Police Leaders for Community Safety in support of the Engaged in Business provision of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Chair now recognizes the ranking member for the entire committee, Mr. Raskin, for his opening statement.
Thank you kindly, Mr. Chairman. Just on that interesting point you raised at the beginning, I think we stand by our math. There are more than 50,000 gun dealer licensees in America, more than 6,000 pawnbroker licensees, and more than 20,000 manufacturer licensees who each have the right to directly sell from their unique physical locations. And that does add up to more than the various fast food outlets and so on that we identified. But we'll submit for the record the exact arithmetic. I'm glad that you at least implicitly seem to agree that if true, this is a shocking statistic that there are that many gun violence dealers in the country. In 2022, shocking levels of gun violence caused Congress to come together after decades of inaction to pass the first major piece of gun safety legislation in 28 years. Ever since President Biden signed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act into law, and with the efforts of the ATF, we've made substantial gains in reversing the gun violence epidemic. We ended 2024 with a 25% drop in nationwide homicides compared to 2022. And of course, firearms are involved in more than 80% of murders in the country. According to the Office of Gun Violence Prevention's one-year progress report in September of last year, more than 600 defendants had been charged under our new gun trafficking and straw purchasing laws, and 900 firearm transfers to people under the age of 21 were prevented by enhanced background checks. The key point is that this law and other Biden administration regulations saved thousands of lives, contributing to 3,500 fewer murders between 2023 and 2024 without ever once infringing on the Second Amendment. And we know this because the Supreme Court never invalidated any part of the Bipartisan Safe Communities Act or any other Biden administration gun safety rule as a violation of the Second Amendment. On the contrary, they've all been deemed to be constitutional. Yet, our colleagues continue to insist that common sense gun safety laws of this type violate the Second Amendment. But the Second Amendment doesn't protect the right of access to a firearm without a violent criminal background check or the right to purchase machine guns or military-style assault weapons. The Supreme Court, including in the DC versus Heller decision, has repeatedly stated that reasonable regulations of firearms to protect public safety are consistent with the Second Amendment. But our colleagues want to preempt state and local law and force Americans to accept more dangerous weapons in their community, all under the guise of protecting the Second Amendment. I challenge my colleagues to explain how any of the Biden administration reforms actually violate the Second Amendment, because no court ever said they did. The problem is that some of our colleagues have completely deformed and misstated what the Second Amendment stands for. Their now infamous insurrectionist theory says that the Second Amendment gives you the right to overthrow the government. Our former colleague Matt Gaetz said the Second Amendment, quote, is about maintaining within the citizenry the ability to maintain an armed rebellion against the government if that becomes necessary. This purported right to overthrow the government means that the people must enjoy access to munitions equivalent to that of the arsenal possessed by the government. As my friend Representative Chip Roy says, the Second Amendment was, quote, designed purposefully to empower the people to resist the force of tyranny used against them. And my friend Lauren Boebert says that the Second Amendment, quote, has nothing to do with hunting unless you're talking about hunting tyrants, maybe. Despite all of this pseudo-revolutionary rhetoric about how the Constitution provides a right of civil insurrection, the actual Constitution, in a half dozen different places, treats insurrection and rebellion not as protected rights, but as serious and dangerous offenses against our government and against our people. Article 1 gives Congress the power to call forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. The Republican Guarantee Clause in Article 4 tells the U.S. to guarantee a Republican form of government to the states and protect them, quote, against domestic violence. These provisions followed Shays' Rebellion, an armed uprising in Massachusetts in the 1780s, which the founders strongly condemned and which influenced the writing of the Constitution. The Constitution thoroughly rejects the right-wing fantasy that random bands of disgruntled citizens can claim the powers of a militia to commit violent acts against the police. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16 reserves, quote, to the states respectively, the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. This intergovernmental cooperation is how we come to have what the Second Amendment calls for in its first clause, a well-regulated militia. This means well-regulated by the government, as the Supreme Court has repeatedly said. The Proud Boys and Oath Keepers are not a militia. A private militia is a contradiction in terms. In 1886, the Supreme Court upheld a state law criminalizing private paramilitary groups, and every state in the Union today bans private militias. A militia is not the reserve power of the people to attack the government. On the contrary, it is the instrument by which the federal and state governments can suppress violent insurrections against the government. Now, today, when I point out these problems with their theory to my distinguished colleagues, they generally fall back on two responses. One is they will quote Patrick Henry, who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," which is great because that was a great bumper sticker in the 18th century. But Patrick Henry was an anti-federalist who opposed the ratification of the Constitution. So that's like quoting speeches by Jefferson Davis to settle the meaning of the 14th Amendment. They also invoke more plausibly the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence for the idea that after a long train of abuses and usurpations, an aggrieved people have the right to alter or abolish the bonds holding them to a tyrannical government. Now that's true, of course, but it's irrelevant because the revolutionaries undoubtedly asserted their right not as a right under the British Constitution or the Magna Carta, but as a matter of natural right to overthrow a tyrannical government. That's very different from saying the Constitution itself guarantees the right to have the means to overthrow the government. If you think that the 2020 presidential election, for example, which Joe Biden won by more than 7 million votes, 306 to 232, is an exercise of tyranny akin to King George's tyranny against the colonists, by all means, you can come down and beat up our police officers and try to overthrow the government. But if we catch you and we stop you, we will prosecute you under the full force of the law and put you in jail, at least until the next president decides to pardon the people who've done that. Look, this fraudulent constitutional philosophy of insurrectionism is exacting a brutal toll on the American people and our social contract by blockading perfectly reasonable and constitutional gun safety measures that are saving lives in America. The whole purpose of the social contract is to make ourselves safer than we would be in a lawless state of nature, which Hobbes described as a state of war. And yet, the Insurrectionist Caucus has brought us gruesome episodes of high-tech military-style violence everywhere in America, from Walmarts to grocery stores to elementary school classrooms. It's time to reassert the real primacy of the Constitution and its real meaning. Thank you. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I didn't know you were going to make it to the yield part. Thank you, Mr. Rask. I would just, since you invoked me directly, I'll respond directly. You said implicit in my statement was that I was shocked at the number of retail gun dealers. I am not shocked by that. It is a legal enterprise. I still question the data that you have, and I would refer you to a couple things. Just Vanderstock v. Garland, the Fifth Circuit case, as well as Heller, McDonald, and Bruin, which contradict. You were essentially arguing against Heller. So with that, since you invoked my name directly, I feel I had the right to respond. And so now,
well, why would you bother to contradict the data if you're proud of that fact?
So now we're going to do is we're going to swear in the witnesses. So, and I would just say this too: without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. And now we'll introduce today's witnesses before we swear them in. Mr. Doug Ritter is the founder and chairman of Knife Rights, a nonprofit organization that advocates on behalf of knife owners. Formed in 2006, Knife Rights advocates at the federal, state, and local levels and engages in litigation to challenge unduly restrictive laws pertaining to the possession and ownership of knives. Ms. Diana Muller is the founder of Women for Gun Rights, a nonprofit organization that advocates for gun rights, education, firearm safety, and violence prevention. She's a retired police officer, having served 22 years with the Tulsa, Oklahoma Police Department. Mr. Dave McDermott is the founding partner of the McDermott Law Group, a firm that specializes in criminal defense and personal injury cases. He's litigated criminal justice cases for more than 27 years and specializes in self-defense cases. Mr. Gregory Jackson is the former deputy director of the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. He's a community organizer, advocate, and campaign strategist. We welcome all of you today. We appreciate your time coming and sharing your expertise with us, and we look forward to hearing from you today. We're now going to ask you to be sworn in, so if you please stand and raise your right hand. Do you, each of you, swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated, and the record will reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. I want you to know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask you to summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. And what that means is about 15 seconds before, I'll just give a couple of raps so you know that it's time to wrap it up. And then once you hit the 5 minutes, I'll hit it a little harder so you know that you're approaching filibuster territory. And then at some point, I'll just have to interrupt. And I'll try not to interrupt because we do want to hear what you have to say. Our first witness today is going to testify as Mr. Ritter. You may begin.
Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member McBath, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify about the Knife Owners Protection Act, or COPA. This bill is common sense criminal justice reform that would protect law-abiding knife owners when they are traveling throughout the U.S., despite whether they are traveling through states or localities with restrictive knife laws. Please indulge me for a moment for a hypothetical. Imagine a chef is driving across the U.S. to cook at guest appearances, perhaps from or in your own districts. The chef has numerous knives in his vehicle, that many of which may exceed some arbitrary local length limitation. Now imagine the chef is stopped by the police for, I don't know, a broken taillight, and the police officer asks, "Do you have any weapons in the vehicle?" The chef, being the responsible citizen that he is, discloses that although he doesn't consider them weapons, he has knives in his vehicle. This simple scenario could result in the chef being arrested and charged. It could result in severe consequences for the chef and in turn for his family. COPA would protect our chef from unnecessary encounters with the police, which too often end in tragedy. This bill is the right policy for everyone. It levels the playing field for all. This is why knife law reform measures have received bipartisan support in many states. Under COPA, if possession of the knife is legal where the journey starts and ends, and the knife is locked up in accordance with COPA, a knife owner would no longer be threatened with arrest simply for traveling from one place to another, even if they have to pass through a jurisdiction where the knife is illegal. Currently, those who travel across the country with knives for work and recreation are subject to arrest and prosecution under a very confusing patchwork of inconsistent state and local laws and regulations. What is perfectly legal in one place may be a serious crime just over the border of that jurisdiction and can carry significant penalties, including jail time. Moreover, enforcement is not uniform, even within jurisdictions. In response to this problem, over the past 16 years, 51 criminal justice reform bills have been enacted in 32 states to repeal bans on various knives that are possessed for work and recreation, and most have had bipartisan support. In fact, the knife reform legislation has been passed in 7 of the 10 states represented on this committee, 5 of them with bipartisan support: Georgia, New York, Tennessee, Texas, and Wisconsin. Other states already do not ban knives of any sort, yet some states and many other localities still have knife bans on the books. Virtually all of the existing knife bans were instituted against the background of racial bias after the Civil War in the late 1950s. We also know all too well that minorities and the economically disadvantaged are too often inappropriately stopped by law enforcement, sometimes with tragic consequences. This bill simply ensures that owners with their knives locked up in accordance with this proposed law are protected and not subject to unjust prosecution for possessing a knife that is legal in the vast majority of the states. Knives are one of humankind's oldest tools possessed and carried by hundreds of millions. They are carried daily by law-abiding laborers, truck drivers, campers, hikers, sportsmen, and sportswomen, and many others as they travel this great nation. COPA would simply provide safe harbor to someone traveling with knives where it is lawful for the knives to be possessed at both points of origin and destination, so long as the knives are transported in accordance with the specific requirements that keep them inaccessible during the intervening travel. These knives will not be a threat to anyone since they are required to be locked up. This bill cannot be used to protect bad actors. If someone transports a knife with the intent to commit an offense that is punishable by imprisonment for more than 1 year, that person cannot be protected by this law. Also, COPA does not override TSA regulations. I strongly urge everyone on this committee, Republican and Democrat alike, to support COPA. This is not a partisan bill. It is a balanced solution to the difficult patchwork of knife laws throughout the United States. COPA is a criminal justice reform bill that protects innocent knife owners while ensuring bad actors are not shielded. I look forward to answering any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Ritter. And now we'll recognize Mr. Jackson for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member McBath, and members of the committee for inviting me to be a part of this important hearing. I'm Greg Jackson, the former Deputy Director for the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention that led our country to a 25% reduction in homicides during the Biden-Harris administration. I spent the last decade of my life working to address gun violence from across the country, and from teens lost in shootings at festivals in Baltimore to bowlers in Lewiston. It is crystal clear that gun violence is shattering communities across our country and stealing from America what President Jefferson acknowledged as our natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As someone raised on a farm in rural Virginia, some of my earliest memories were hunting with my father and celebrating the rich heritage of his first rifle, a Winchester Ranger shotgun, as he handed it down to me. But in 2013, my life changed forever when I was caught in the crossfire when walking home in Washington, D.C., and the bullet that struck me left me within 50% of dying that night, and one of the hardest nights of my life by far. But since I was shot, more than 1 million Americans have been shot or killed by this crisis. Students in elementary schools, worshipers in churches, senior citizens in grocery stores, and even fans at Super Bowl parades. You know, every year over 140,000 Americans are shot, and that's equivalent to double the crowd of the Super Bowl. That's equivalent to our entire active duty for the U.S. Marine Corps being shot every single year. And this is now the leading cause of death for youth in America, and also a leading cause of death for pregnant women in America, and now a leading cause of newly disabled Americans. And during the height of the pandemic, gun deaths surged, increasing homicides by 45% and even gun suicides by nearly 10%. And as the nation mourned in 2022 when mass shootings struck in Buffalo and Uvalde, activists like myself and those sitting behind me demanded action. And we saw Democrats and Republicans step up and work together to pass the first law in 30 years, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. This bill took important steps to advancing our background check system, making gun trafficking a federal offense, and prohibiting gun purchases from domestic abusers. It also invested $15 billion, which created the largest investment in youth mental health, adding 14,000 school-based mental health professionals to our schools, creating the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, and also provided historic investments in law enforcement and community-based violence intervention programs across our country. And after signing this law, President Biden created our office to implement this law, to expand partnerships, to improve services for those impacted, but also to identify new ideas. And when we saw things like 76% of school shootings coming from guns in the home, we worked with the Department of Education to launch the first ever school-based safe storage campaign. When we saw Glock switches terrorizing communities in places like Birmingham, we worked with ATF to shut down over 350 websites that were selling these Glock switches to Americans from China. And we took innovative approaches to address this crisis within the bounds of the law and the Second Amendment. But most importantly, our actions saved lives. In 2023, we saw a 12% decline in homicides. And in 2024, we surpassed those reductions, bringing down homicides by 14% and a 10% reduction in violent crimes. And these reductions were actually steepest in major cities that had tough gun laws and had strong leaders resourcing law enforcement and community-based strategies. Boston went down 80%. Greensboro down 41%. Milwaukee down 42%. Philadelphia down 36%. Baltimore down 22%. The state of Arizona down 50%, the steepest decline in that state's history. And even places like Miami saw the lowest number of homicides since the 1950s. There's no accident. This is no accident when we see these numbers. This is a direct result of strong gun laws and strong investments in strategies that we know work and can save lives. And frankly, I'll close with this. I mean, these percentages and data, I think for so many people, you hear them and you see them as numbers, but we know there's more than numbers. In 2023, I lost my mentee, DeMarcos. He was literally on his front porch after basketball practice and was shot and killed as a bystander. I mean, you literally sit next to a strong leader and champion, Congressman McBath, who lost her son to a fatal but preventable shooting. And we know that with every number and every life we save, that's one more family that gets to go to a wedding instead of a funeral, that gets to attend a baby shower instead of walking to a hospital to decide if their loved one has been lost. And so we stand proudly by this work. We know that these gun laws and these resources, they save lives, they make our families safer, they make your family safer, and they make America safer. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we're going to recognize Mr. McDermott for his 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member McBath, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to share my experiences as a leading self-defense attorney in this country. My name is David McDermott. I've been a private criminal defense attorney for 27 years. I'm the founding partner of McDermott Law Group, which is also referred to as Not Your Typical Attorneys. For the past 10 years, I've focused on a niche area of defending people after they've had to defend themselves. I refer to these cases as self-defense cases, although a prosecutor's office refers to them as murder cases, attempt murder cases, or a host of other cases stemming from criminal charges. I provided legal representation to hundreds of people throughout the country, both before and after they've been involved in self-defense incident, and you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody that's litigated more of these cases. I have appeared on or in multiple news channels, podcasts, magazines, radio shows, and newspapers to discuss these cases and answer questions on self-defense laws. I've given countless lectures in front of thousands of people in multiple states throughout the country on the issue of self-defense, and I've garnered a nationwide reputation for consistently securing not guilty verdicts after asserting self-defense on behalf of my clients. A good number of people that I've represented in this matter are U.S. Concealed Carry Association members, also known as the USCCA. USCCA is one of the largest and fastest growing organizations dedicated to educating and training responsible gun owners. I'm a proud member of the USCCA and one of the critical response attorneys for over 860,000 members nationwide. Training and education are paramount to being a responsible gun owner, and in my opinion, nobody does this better than the USCCA. This type of exposure and knowledge helps to navigate through these stressful and highly intense situations, to better understand what people should and shouldn't do, and where necessary, to save lives in the process. I'm incredibly passionate about what I do for a couple reasons. First, I believe in what I do. I believe in a person's constitutional right to defend him or herself as well as others. Second, I was a victim of a random act of violence, which also allows me to personally relate to the fear my clients describe when they find themselves involved in these situations. At the age of 17, I was walking with my then girlfriend, now wife, Dana, one of my sisters and new friends, when a large group of gang members ran over to us. As they grabbed the hat off the head of one of my friends, I quickly turned to my sister and Dana and told them to run. I was certain we were about to be attacked. As soon as I could say this, though, I was hit very hard in the head with a blunt object. I immediately went down to my knees as I was beaten repeatedly with a lead pipe and baseball bat. Dana and my sister were held at gunpoint as these gangbangers continued to beat me bloody. As luck would have it, a police officer happened to drive by in the parking lot next to where this was happening, and the gang members quickly dispersed. Nobody wakes up and says, I hope today's the day where I get attacked, and I wonder if I'm going to die. Unfortunately, these acts of random violence happen more than we want to believe. We often see or hear about these incidents in the news when we turn on the TV or the radio. With such a focus and emphasis on violent crimes, it comes as little surprise that more and more people have decided to purchase firearms to defend themselves. Unfortunately, many people find themselves in situations where they're forced to defend themselves and then being criminally charged after doing so. My firm has had 5 self-defense jury trials set this month alone. The first of these trials was scheduled to start yesterday, but as luck would have it, we were able to convince the prosecutor to dismiss the case against our client. I have no shortage of exposure to these types of cases, which is why I'm excited to be in front of you, to share some perspective as to what happens after someone has been involved in a self-defense shooting. I often say this with self-defense shooting cases. You can go from being a victim of the aggressor to being a victim of the system as quickly as you pull the trigger. Our system is flawed when it comes to self-defense, as there's a lot of ignorance when it comes to this topic. The fact that we lack uniformity in our nation's laws is a significant contributing factor. For example, if you're being attacked and you reasonably believe you're about to receive great bodily harm or death, some states require you to attempt to run or flee from your attacker before using lethal force to defend yourself, while others allow you to stand your ground. Whether and how you can defend yourself shouldn't come down to what state you're in. Everyone should have the right to defend themselves in the same way. The disparity between these different rules of engagement concerning self-defense has caused a lot of confusion. From my personal experience, this confusion is not merely confined to people outside the legal profession, but people in the legal profession as well. I've seen attorneys, criminal defense attorneys, prosecuting attorneys, and even judges that have been mistaken about the self-defense laws of the jurisdiction in which they practice. If this isn't bad enough, there's such a negative stigma concerning firearms in this country. Many people believe that all firearms are bad. Some even going so far as to believe that people that own firearms are bad as well. Many believe that they shouldn't be able to carry or to defend themselves with firearms. Some of these people that share these beliefs are judges. Others are potential jurors. Imagine being the victim of a violent attack, being robbed, being carjacked. Imagine you reasonably believe you're about to receive great bodily harm or death. Imagine that the only way to stop this threat is to shoot the attacker. Imagine protecting yourself under these circumstances. Now imagine a legal system that is divided in terms of how it perceives this incident. A system that regards you as the criminal after defending yourself. A system that arrests you. A system that criminally charges you. A system where attorneys and or judges don't always apply the correct law. A system where you are being prejudged merely because you own a firearm and or because you chose to protect yourself with that firearm. This is not the system we want for the people of the United States. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr. McDermott. Now we recognize Ms. Mueller for her 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Biggs and Ranking Member McBath and Raskins. I'm Diana Mueller. I'm a 22-year retired police officer from Tulsa Police Department. I'm a national and world champion shooter and a founder of Women for Gun Rights, a nonpartisan organization dedicated to safeguarding the Second Amendment. It's an honor to represent the countless women who have experienced unthinkable tragedy and crime like murder, rape, domestic violence, and stalking. Their stories are absolutely horrifying, but underscore the importance of our organization and the desire of citizens to protect themselves and their families. Everyone in this room, Democrat and Republican, red shirt or teal shirt, we all have the same goal. We all want to be safe. Women for Gun Rights believes that education is the key to firearm safety and violence prevention. Women are the fastest growing group of gun owners in our nation, and for good reason. We are smaller and less equipped for violence, and firearms level the playing field in an attack from a larger, faster assailant. Women are choosing to carry to protect a life, not to take a life. I applaud the majority for having this hearing, highlighting the positive attributes of guns and gun ownership, and welcoming input from people with experience with firearms, with training, and with violence. With 22 years of work in the police work, I can tell you that you are your own first responder. On February 22nd of 2024, Lake and Riley went for a jog in broad daylight on a campus in a nice area. She was physically fit, she's brilliant, she's beautiful, but she had no idea the evil she would meet that day. She fought for 18 minutes to save her life. I've been in fights, and 2 minutes is a long time. She fought for 18. She was her own first responder, but she didn't have the tools to come out a victor. One of our best tools is our mind, and how we prepare that is critical for survival. Words have power, and each of you have influence in your communities. If you are telling women that they cannot protect themselves, or that she's more likely to have a gun taken from her and used against her, you're creating a victim. Women for Gun Rights is intent on empowering women and creating victors, not victims. Stop telling women they can't. They can. For example, one of our delegates from New Mexico was asleep in bed. Middle of the night, a serial rapist let out early, broke into her home, attacked her in bed. He had a firearm. She fought him, gained control of his firearm, and shot him 3 times and ran out of the house. The gun that was intended to harm her saved her life. On the other hand, you have Amanda. She was prepared. She had a concealed carry permit, she was a self-defense person, and she parked next to the campus police station. But one night, going to her car, a violent attack happened. He raped her. Not only did he rape her, he went on to kidnap, rape, and kill his 3rd victim. He's in prison now, but Amanda is confident if she had not been legislated out of the opportunity to protect herself, her story and the other girl's story would have come out differently. The law, the common sense law that was supposed to protect her, was the law that made her a victim and caused her pain and another to lose her life. I implore you, stop working against women and start empowering them. If you want to save lives, I respectfully request that this body fund training for our citizens, especially women, to learn how to avoid conflict and survive an attack with any tool she deems fit for the job. It's her body, it's her choice, right? I'll close with this. The Second Amendment, and self-defense for that matter, should not be a partisan issue, but it seems like the Democrats have coalesced against it. I, for one, am encouraged by the efforts of this Congress and this administration to restore our constitutionally protected freedoms and make guns great again.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McDermott, I take it you're from Chicago in the Windy City, right?
That's correct.
Tell us everything. So I'm just north of you in Wisconsin. Everything I understand is that you have some of the toughest gun laws in the country in the city of Chicago.
In certain respects, but we also have the right to stand your ground. So yes, we have tough gun laws, but when it comes to self-defense, we do have the right to stand your ground, although most people don't know that.
Have those tough gun laws made Chicago safer?
Not in my opinion, not at all. Unfortunately, there are, as I'm sure you know, approximately 120 firearms in this country for every 100 citizens. A lot of those firearms are in Chicago. There was a period of time where the vast majority during COVID were being purchased out of Illinois. So we have a tremendous amount of firearms that are being purchased to combat the firearms that are already in existence there. More and more people are being attacked violently in Chicago. More and more people are in serious fear of being attacked by those individuals, and they're trying to, as best as possible, arm themselves against the situation.
And yet those tough gun laws have not reversed that trend, is that correct?
Not in any way.
Okay. Ms. Mueller, do gun-free zones work? We see gun-free zones, you see the signs regularly, schools, other places like that. Do gun-free zones work?
No, sir, they do not. They are actually the opposite of what they are intended to do. When you see a gun-free zone, 94% of mass public shootings happen in gun-free zones. They are killers. They shoot fish in a barrel. They are killers.
Yeah, so I've had administrators say to me that just give us the option to be able to not put that sign, gun-free zone, on the front of our school, and it actually would make it safer. Do you agree with those school administrators?
I absolutely agree. I believe that if you put the sign that said that there were people armed in there and people weren't actually armed, that would make your school safer.
I want to talk to you a little bit about you, and the final page of the testimony that I saw from you in regards to mental health. I really find it very interesting where you get into psychotropic drugs and things like that, and how much we give this to people. And in particular, I'm concerned about the amount of psychotropic drugs that are given to boys in like 6, 7 years of age in kindergarten, first grade, to control their behavior, and I believe it's rewiring their brains. Now, I don't have scientific evidence of that, but I think we should be doing some research in regards to it. Tell us what you think are some solutions for that could be helpful to prevent some of these shootings that happen as a result of mental health breakdowns.
That's a great question. I do, and I'm not a doctor, and that is a deep, deep well that you just dove into. But I do know that when you tell me that there are black box warning labels and that it causes homicidal and suicidal tendencies, that's pretty much a no-brainer as to why don't we look and do some studies as to how these drugs are affecting our kids and even our adults. So I would like research in that area.
Do you, have you not found much research? Because I haven't either, and it seems to me it's something that there should be, you think about the National Institute of Health and how they've squirreled or I can't use that term here at the dais, how they've wasted money, the American taxpayers' money. It seems like something like this would be a really good research project, especially at some leading universities around America. I mean, isn't there much more research that needs to be done?
Well, and I'm glad that you brought that up because just like it seems like there's one-sided research in several different areas, not only in the mental health and how it affects guns, but also just the gun-related deal. Because the CDC did do a study in 2013, and the numbers that this saves, that's what's missing from this conversation, is that the number of 48,000 deaths annually from firearms-related causes is a horrible number. But you guys are leaving out the conversation, the number of saves. That study, I think it said 3 million, up to 3 million saves annually. And if we're gonna look at apples and apples, yes, 45,000 deaths is terrible, but when you compare that to the 3 million that it saved, we should be having that conversation as well. It's disingenuous.
Yeah, thank you in regards to that.
And it's scrubbed from the CDC. It's no longer there.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, I think that we should be following up with the administration to try to get better research in regards to this and get more comprehensive research. I want to ask one other question for Mr. Ritter. Give us some context of these crime statistics that we've just been hearing from the other side. Hasn't crime been going down for a few decades, had a spike in 2020, and now is coming back down? Could you give us some context?
Gentleman's time has expired, but we'll allow the witness to answer.
So these statistics primarily deal with a broad range of weapons. My concern is knives. We certainly see that crimes committed with knives have remained somewhat steady over the years if you look at the FBI statistics. And we know that the majority of those crimes are committed with chef's knives. So if you want to ban knives, maybe take everyone's chef's knives away.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the ranking member, Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And before I ask my questions, I just want to say in reference to what Mr. McDermott said is absolutely the truth. It's correct. The guns coming into Illinois, we know specifically are trafficked from outside that state, as that's happening all around the country. The Office of Gun Violence Prevention made demonstrable improvement in reducing gun violence in America. In its first days in office, the Trump administration eliminated the office, threatening the progress that we've made in gun violence. Mr. Jackson, my questions are for you. If you can be succinct, because I have a number of questions for you. The Trump White House shuttered the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. What work won't happen as a result of that?
Well, there's no longer a team that's focused every day on getting the resources to life-saving strategies. We talked about domestic violence, but one of our jobs was pushing over $450 million to states to help them implement strategies to remove firearms from domestic abusers. But now, without our office there to oversee the dollars getting to the communities needed, implementing and expediting laws or executive actions, frankly, processes will be slowed and unfortunately lives will be lost.
Please tell us how state and local governments have taken up the mantle of the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention.
Yeah, I mean, seeing the results that we saw federally, when we started the administration, there was only one statewide Office of Gun Violence Prevention. Now there's 14. There were only 20 at the city level. Now there's 140. And across the country, watching cities and states think about how do they prevent violence, looking at an all-of-government approach to not only keep guns out of the hands of those who are most at risk or most vulnerable, but how do we invest in mental health, behavioral health, community violence intervention, crime, gun intelligence, law enforcement to reduce violence.
Some Republicans are attempting to defund federal law enforcement, including the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the ATF. How important is the ATF to state and local law enforcement's efforts to solve violent crime and protect our communities?
When we traveled the country, we heard firsthand from local law enforcement how important ATF is. There are real limitations to what local law enforcement can do. And we looked at, for example, ATF prosecuted over 680 gun traffickers. Like Mr. McDermott said, guns that are moving from one state into another, ATF is the team that can prosecute and get those criminals off the streets. They also made sure that 4,600 domestic abusers were prohibited from getting firearms and made sure they didn't purchase firearms through the enhanced background check system. So the ATF is crucial to look at how guns are moving across states and causing harm, but also looking upstream at how do we hold traffickers, gun dealers, and the manufacturers accountable.
Thank you. And everyone is affected by gun violence. Have rural communities been receptive to these CVI programs?
Rural communities have heavily embraced our work, and frankly, when we think about gun violence, it's homicides and suicides are such a devastating part of this problem, but we know that suicides are most intensely impacting older white males in rural America. And that's why our office partnered with the Department of Veterans Affairs, even connected with the Department of Agriculture, to think about how do we educate our older Americans about lethal means and safe storage, but also start to empower families on how they can leverage tools like extreme risk protection orders to ensure that their elder family members are safe even in those moments of crisis.
So what more should we be doing to support state and local law enforcement?
Well, we have to continue to invest and resource them. And we had a roundtable with President Biden with police chiefs from across the country. And the number one thing that they said supported their work was having true community partners. And that's where investments in community violence intervention and victim services played a huge role in ensuring that it's not just law enforcement trying to solve this problem, that we have health departments and doctors and community organizations and schools and principals all equipped with tools and resources to prevent violence before it happens. So we have to keep building on that. We have to strengthen the full ecosystem that's working together to keep our communities safe. And we can do that by passing the Office of Gun Violence Act that will create an office beyond the White House, but also just protecting those important investments through the appropriations process.
There's been so much success, but we also have so much more to do, and we have to keep going. We have to continue to make sure that we're keeping all of our communities safe. I myself, having been exposed to gun violence directly, I care about everyone's community. I don't care what side of the aisle we sit on, we have to keep our communities safe. I have a unanimous consent request. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an article by Alicia Ibaraji entitled "More Than Half of U.S. Teachers Think Being Armed Would Make Students Less Safe," reports findings, published by CNN on May 21st.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the witnesses being here today in attendance. Ms. Mueller, are you familiar with the ATF's zero tolerance policy that was implemented by Biden's ATF?
I have heard of it.
What are some of the consequences of taking these aggressive enforcement actions, do you think?
Well, I'll begin with, I'm a professional shooter, I'm not an FFL, but what I do understand, and I hear from people who are FFLs, is that the Biden administration and the way they went to, it wasn't a partnership anymore, it was more of an adversarial relationship, and therefore it really hurt the relationship between the FFLs and the ATF. So I think it was a mistake, and not really going after the right target.
Yeah, I mean, they're usually our front lines, right? I mean, they're keeping prohibited buyers off of the purchasing rolls, if you will. So I would think working with the ATF would be beneficial, but often I think it looked like it was adversarial, and some of the FFLs were targeted in many ways, I think, by the ATF. So it was counterproductive. Really what they were intended to do and what they should have been doing, maybe it's two different things, and I think it sends a wrong message a lot of times. So tell me, I've got a wife and 2 daughters. They're both concealed carry. Tell me how being able to carry a firearm really, it levels the playing field for our female folks who are on the streets in dangerous situations. Tell us a little bit about that. How does that help?
It really does level the playing field and give us a chance. I believe that the people that advocate for gun control are doing it with good intentions, but they're doing it from a place of privilege. If you don't think that you need the Second Amendment and you don't think that you need to carry a firearm or have training or have self-defense as a defense, then you're coming from a place of privilege. You're not living in a community that is plagued with violence. You're not living in a community that needs to have that kind of security. So I would check your privilege and say that the Second Amendment is what gives everyone the right to be safe.
And I would agree with that. I think very often, you know, the left in the country wants to disarm its citizens, and then at the same time, they often, you know, call for defunding the police. And you put those citizens in a tough spot because you don't want them armed to defend themselves. And in many cases, the DAs and AGs in those communities were turning criminals loose with a slap on the wrist, basically, sometimes just cash bail. And so I think it puts those folks in those communities in grave danger. Mr. McDermott, I noticed Memorial Day weekend in Chicago, you said, well, there was actually the statistics where 34 were shot, 8 were killed, and the youngest was a 20-year-old. And you said in Chicago, we're seeing more and more gun purchases, but why are we seeing that? What's going on?
Well, quite frankly, the reason we're seeing more people purchasing firearms is because there's such an emphasis on defunding the police. There's so many different rules and regulations put in place to restrict what police can and can't do. With respect to, for example, carjackings, which are a very significant crime in Chicago, they're very often being taking place. And we are now saying the police can't, or not just now, but we've been saying police can't pursue these vehicles after a certain speed. There's no way for people to be able to protect themselves, there's no way for people to really feel a particular comfort in the police being able to protect them from these types of dangers. They're seeing it. It's constantly on the news. It's constantly in their face, and more people are purchasing firearms to be able to defend themselves. And I think a big issue here, a lot of people direct the issue towards guns. There's not an issue with guns. The issue is with criminals, and we continue to empower criminals on a daily basis. We continue to write laws that help criminals to get away with more crime, and to disable at the same time those law-abiding citizens that are being put in a position where they're forced to defend themselves.
Great. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the entire committee from Maryland, Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Jackson, guns are the leading cause of death for young people in America. Guns are, I learned from you, the leading cause of death for pregnant women in America. They are the leading cause of disabilities for newly disabled people. I learned from you. I know that the U.S. Has more firearms than people, and I know that, excuse me, I know that we've got a firearm homicide rate 25 times higher than other comparable wealthy countries. Now, I hear the argument that because our society is swimming in firearms, that people need more firearms to defend themselves. Of course, people have a constitutional right to purchase a handgun to defend themselves, right? Under the Heller versus District of Columbia case. Isn't that right?
Correct.
So people have that right. So it seems to me that the argument that is being advanced is a huge non sequitur. The claim is being made, pushing an open door that people have a right to a gun to defend themselves if that's how they choose to defend themselves. And therefore, we shouldn't do anything else to try to limit the staggering amount of gun violence in society. Now, you're here to tell us that the Biden administration saw great success. Will you just give us what were the major elements of that success in reducing gun violence?
Right. I mean, just to build on your statement, I mean, if guns made us safer, we would definitely be the safest country in the world, considering how many firearms are in our communities. But we knew that gun violence is about more than just solving a crime. It's about preventing a health crisis. And so we looked at strategies to help victims heal, investing in the Crime Victims Fund and VOCA, investing in violence intervention programs and law enforcement crime intelligence strategies.
Okay, were any of those things struck down as violative of anybody's Second Amendment rights?
No.
Okay, so why isn't everybody celebrating across the aisle that we actually saved thousands of lives through the things the Biden administration did without violating anybody's Second Amendment rights?
It baffles me because I think we should all have the same goal of saving lives, and we now have a strategy that has been proven for 2 years in a row to save historic lives. And our cities are frankly, I mean, Boston had an 82% reduction. I don't know how we can even debate.
82% reduction in
homicide.
Gun homicides.
Yes.
So can you explain this to me? People have a right to a gun to defend themselves. Everybody agrees to that. You never challenged that, did you, in your office?
Correct.
Okay. And why is it that people are taking the position we shouldn't be doing anything to reduce gun violence other than selling more guns?
You know, I think frankly there's, you know, the gun industry is big business. We talked about there being over, 20,000, 30,000, 25,000 FFLs. And frankly, that may not sound big to some folks, but that's enough to fill Madison Square Garden. And there's a lot of profit to be made in selling firearms, but we've seen firsthand that that's not how we prevent violence.
Yeah.
Guns don't make us safe. Preventing violence is what makes us safe, and that's what we proved that has worked.
So the whole point of the social contract, if you read John Locke or Hobbes or Rousseau, anybody who wrote about the social contract, is we'll be safer coming together with laws than we would be if we were just in a state of war, a state of violence against each other. So if we're talking about how to promote self-defense, aren't the laws that you're talking about themselves instruments of self-defense and community safety?
Correct. I mean, I think we should always focus on preventing a conflict in the first place. I mean, we talked a little about stand your ground laws here today, but I'll be upfront with you. If I tried to stand my ground when I was shot, I'd be dead because evading is the number one way to move.
What about, there's so many of these spectacular mass gun shootings at schools and Walmarts and so on, where there were armed guards around, right?
Right.
And there are lots of cases where they just go right through the guards.
And we think about Uvalde, where we had hundreds of law enforcement, where we had Buffalo, where armed folks engaged the shooter and lost. And we have to realize that the way that we can truly save lives is preventing someone from walking onto a campus or approaching senior citizens in a grocery store in the first place.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to bring to the committee's attention what is the single most radical attack on the Second Amendment that we have seen in a long, long time. It is a bill that was just introduced in the California legislature, AB 1333, the relevant text of which is here behind me. And what this bill seeks to do is to effectively overturn the Castle Doctrine, to say that it is no longer a justifiable form of self-defense to defend a habitation or property. Now, you might say, well, okay, something crazy is being proposed in California. What else is new? But one of the advocacy groups for this measure, in fact, that by all reports seems to have written the measure, has stated that this bill is, quote, a blueprint for the rest of the nation. And so I think it is worth taking very seriously the outrageous affront to the Second Amendment that this measure represents. Even jurisdictions that have the weakest protections for the Second Amendment and for the right to self-defense have generally upheld the castle doctrine. Even states that impose a right to retreat, let's say, when you're confronted with deadly force, still maintain the basic view that your home is your castle and you have the right to defend yourself if there is a home invasion. After all, if you're confronted in your home, where are you supposed to retreat to? I mean, let's just try to get our minds around the absurdity of this idea. You're asleep in your home in the middle of the night, a burglar breaks into your home, is heading to the room where your young children are fast asleep, and what are you supposed to do? You have to affirmatively somehow confirm that this individual is actually posing a risk? This is what I believe the Latin is res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. He has just invaded your home in the middle of the night. Of course he's posing a risk. So what are you supposed to do? You're running through a metal detector, and only then, if it goes off, you have the right to defend yourself and your family and your children? Just think about what the impact, if this is going to be. It will massively tip the scales in favor of the criminal in the case of such a confrontation. It puts the onus on you, the victim, an ordinary citizen minding your own business in your own home, whose home has just been invaded, to somehow meet a set of legal requirements before exercising your inherent right to self-defense. And the criminal, knowing this, will use it to press their advantage. Indeed, more broadly, criminals knowing that homeowners have been rendered defenseless will be much more likely to burglarize homes. And citizens, knowing the legal peril that they might face, will be less likely to take steps to actually defend themselves, which again will incentivize more burglaries. Again, this is a measure that the lead advocacy group called a blueprint for the rest of the nation. So maybe I'll pose this question to Mr. McDermott. Ms. Mueller, if you have any thoughts as well. What do you see as the risk of a measure like this, and how can we assure that we are protecting the Second Amendment rights of folks across the country in the face of these proposals?
Thanks for the question. I think more than anything else, as Ms. Mueller put it, many of these people that are enacting or proposing the enactment of these laws come from a place of privilege. I represent a lot of these people post-self-defense incident. It's an entirely different story. It's entirely different when you have to speak on somebody's behalf, defend them in court as to what they did, and something that many people would think makes sense. It was something that was life-sustaining. It was something which was necessary to preserve the lives of their family. Criminals are not restricted in their ability to commit crimes, but yet so many law-abiding citizens are restricted in their ability to defend themselves. And this is another way in which that happens. I think a very serious concern here, and I talked about it in my opening statement, is the fact that we are imposing or suggesting the imposition of additional duty retreat states, duty retreat jurisdictions. And this is very wrong. This is basically coming from a place of, I liken this to Monday morning quarterbacking, where you basically, when I'm litigating these cases in court in real time, and I'm listening to all these different things, and I'm taking this all in, knowing what my client actually went through, and you've got somebody that's sitting in the comfortable place of their home, and they're watching the football game on a big screen, and they see all the different options that the quarterback has when he hikes the ball. The quarterback is seeing a number of different people running at him, full speed, big people getting ready to take him out, has seconds, sometimes milliseconds to go ahead and respond in those types of situations. And then people on Monday morning, just like lawmakers, unfortunately, in different jurisdictions, are saying, you know what, you should have done this differently. And it's pretty sad, it's pretty pathetic, and it's not helping people to defend themselves, which is an innate right. Everybody in this room can agree that everybody has a right to defend themselves. It's just half this room is disagreeing as to why or how they can do that.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Goldman.
Well, I agree with Mr. McDermott. Everybody in this room recognizes there's a right to self-defense, so I hope my colleague from California is permitted by his former colleagues to speak at the hearing on the California bill that is not a bill in this Congress. Mr. McDermott, I want to just clarify something you said. You said earlier on that in Chicago, the gun laws have not worked. I beg to differ. The Everytown gun law rankings that just came out, and I'm happy to introduce this, has Illinois, in terms of its gun law strength, at number 3. California's 1, Massachusetts 2, Illinois 3, my home state of New York 4. The problem with those states is that there is an iron pipeline where guns that are manufactured outside of those states are trafficked into those states. The ATF is the federal government agency that is charged, and I believe, Mr. Jackson, am I right, that the ATF is the only one with technology that can trace guns?
They're definitely the best at it.
Yeah, and so most local law enforcement send the guns to the ATF to trace so that they can figure out where they're coming from. That allows us to enforce federal laws against gun trafficking. Now, I want to raise a different point here because not only was Kash Patel recently confirmed to be the director of the FBI, he has never managed a local bakery, much less an institution of the size of the FBI. But then President Trump named him also to be the acting director of the ATF. Mr. Patel spoke at the inaugural summit of an organization called the Gun Owners of America, which says on its website that they advocate for abolishing the ATF. Mr. Jackson, briefly, can you just summarize what would happen if the ATF were abolished?
I mean, we would lose the ability to federally enforce rogue gun dealers, to focus on disrupting problematic iron pipelines, as you spoke of. There's multiple across the country. To prosecute gun traffickers. It would greatly handicap our background check system and our ability to identify and frankly deny dangerous sales of firearms. And most importantly, it will strip us of the ability to look out for emerging threats. We know that there are things like Glock switches and innovations that are happening every day that are making
guns,
weapons
right?
more deadly.
Ghost guns as well. Now, that's not just a potential problem, that's a real problem because the president has issued an executive order to reevaluate every gun regulation that has been implemented by the Biden administration through Mr. Jackson and the excellent work and part of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. Now, one of those rules is the engaged in the business of selling guns rule, which is clearly a target of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. And it's pretty remarkable to me because that rule, which is often referred to as the zero tolerance policy, revokes federal firearm licenses for people who, one, willfully transfer a firearm to a prohibited person, someone who the law says is not allowed to own a gun. 2, fails to run a required background check. 3, falsify records. 4, fail to respond to a tracing request. Or 5, refuse to permit ATF to conduct an inspection in violation of the law. In other words, that regulation is designed solely to enforce the law. And yet, for some reason, that is a purported infringement on our Second Amendment rights. Ms. Mueller, I have a couple quick questions for you. Is there a Second Amendment right for a mentally ill person to own a firearm?
There isn't one that isn't.
Is there a Second Amendment right for, I just have a little time, for someone convicted of or with an outstanding order from domestic violence to own a gun?
Repeat the question, please.
Can someone who has committed domestic violence own a gun? Is there a Second Amendment right?
Gentleman's time has expired. You may
No,
answer the
sir.
question if you can. Thank you.
No, sir.
No, there's not. This is not a Second Amendment.
Your
issue
time
that
has
we're
expired,
talking
sir. Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Nels.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Kiley, thank you for your questions. You think about California. Well, it's California. You figured that. You know, as an old sheriff in Fort Bend County, Texas, we love the great state of Texas. You come into the great state of Texas, you start waving a gun around and threatening our citizens, or you break into a home in the state of Texas, you're leaving in a bag. You will leave in a bag. And as a sheriff, many did, breaking into people's homes, their castles, threatening, scaring people. That's California for you, but I tell you, not in the great state of Texas, we won't allow it. First, I want to ask about the effect of left-wing DAs charging people with crimes for engaging in obvious self-defense or defense of others. Mr. Daniel Penny, his name comes to mind as a recent example. Last year, Mr. Penny restrained Jordan Neely on the New York City subway after Neely continued to threaten women and children on the train, which unfortunately resulted in his death. I'm sure that Mr. Penny didn't want to have to take the man's life. Nobody wants to do that. Although this was an obvious case of self-defense of others, Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg charged Penny with manslaughter, likely due to public pressure from the left-wing radicals who felt Mr. Neely should have been be allowed to threaten women and children with impunity. And even though the jury came to an obvious outcome of a full acquittal, didn't take long, a full acquittal, the damage to Mr. Penny had already been done. He had been through an 18-month ordeal in which his name and reputation, they drug it through the mud. So the government, the media's message to New Yorkers was clear. Dare to protect your fellow citizens, and we will destroy your life. You know, the old Good Samaritan. Do you have Good Samaritans out there anymore? You may not have them anymore. Why would anybody do it when you have nut jobs like Alvin Bragg and others that want to go after and make the individual that wants to help other people, he's all of a sudden the suspect? Mr. McDermott, do these kinds of political prosecutions deter people from coming to the defense of others? And how does that put at risk vulnerable populations like women and children and the elderly? In other words, how important is it? How important is it for us to have a society where people feel empowered to come to the defense of the vulnerable, Mr. McDermott?
Obviously, the question answers itself. It's extremely important. We have a number of different problems. First off, many people recognize the right to defend themselves, and very often they disregard the right to defend others, as happened in that particular case. There are certain uniform, I would say, rules in this space. There are certain things that you see repeating themselves very often. For example, my clients that are being charged with very serious charges, the majority of these clients, the vast majority of these clients, close to all of them, have no criminal backgrounds. Yet the victims that are being the complaining witnesses in these cases do have backgrounds. They have violent backgrounds. I have a client right now that's in custody that will not release from custody because it's been determined that she's a danger to society. She's a grandmother. She's protecting herself. She's protecting her daughter. She's protecting her 75-year-old mother from two grown men that were beating on them, and she's being charged. So this is happening just far too often.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. McDermott. I got one minute left. Talk about the Second Amendment, uniformity in the Second Amendment. Based on the current laws of the states of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, for example, a Pennsylvania resident could receive an 18-month prison sentence and a $10,000 fine simply for possessing a knife in New Jersey that he is legally allowed to have in Pennsylvania. So, Mr. Ritter, how do you think that is in the spirit of the Second Amendment? How does the lack of uniformity among states, even in what kind of knife one can carry, degrade the right to self-defense?
So the issue is, under Bruin, there really is no defense for creating a ban on a particular kind of knife, because all of these knives are common. All of these knives are, quite frankly, less dangerous than a firearm. The purpose of my bill is to ensure that if someone from your great state of Texas is going to the great state of New Hampshire and has to pass through New Jersey, that they can do so without risk of being in prison for simply carrying a knife that's legal at both the start and the finish of their journey, as long as they lock it up. This is about protecting your constituents.
Thank you, Mr. Ritter. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Knott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's interesting that my friends on the other side of the aisle have tiptoed around the issue and even claimed to be not against the Second Amendment. They're not hostile towards the Second Amendment, but life experience and observation of any objective record shows that they are very hostile towards the Second Amendment. Even some of the cases that they have cited in limited support of their questions, whether it be Heller or Bruin, the Democratic Party has been against those in lockstep and have been challenging those at lower circuits ever since those opinions went into effect. And even in these questions, the insinuation that there are far too many guns in the United States. You should pass more laws, but don't buy more guns. You should prosecute people who are too aggressive in self-defense. You should prosecute the use of lethal force, even if it results in the death of an attacker. These are things that are fundamentally contrarian and against the claim that they are not for the Second Amendment. And one of the statements that was made by a witness at the panel says that guns do not make us safe. And as a career prosecutor, I have to differ, in my opinion, in the strongest sense. And I'll start with you, Ms. Mueller. Do you agree with that statement? And in your experience as a police officer, one statement that you made said that we are our own first responders. So in your experience, ma'am, what is your opinion on whether or not guns do in fact make us safe?
You're on a roll, too. Yeah. That's good. What's up with that?
I've tried. Sir.
Unless it just like whatever was happening, it froze it because your mic's.
Yeah.
Never a dull moment.
Because they want you to yield your time at the end.
Okay, after he's heard everything.
Correct. Yep.
No. That's all right. Will this work? It must have been like a short circuit or something.
Can I grab you?
Jim leave?
No, he's going to come back. Miss Lee is going to yield time, give him a chance to speak.
And Mr. Knott to step
And
on, and the clock also. Okay. Failure.
Right in the middle of my questions.
Oh, was it in the middle?
I know.
Did you think where you got your phone too close to the mic and started making noises?
There wasn't anywhere noises. I was asking, and Ms. Mueller, she was hitting her button and it wouldn't.
Oh, well, sort of the way the whole day's going.
Yeah.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3.
Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3.
Subcommittee's called back to order. We appreciate your patience. We've rebooted the whole system. And Mr. Knott had been recognized, and so Mr. Knott, we recognize you for the completion of 5 minutes.
Thank you. Ms. Muller, do you remember the question I asked? Essentially, the notion that guns don't make us safe. In your experience as a law enforcement officer, as a woman who carries, do you agree with that statement? Why or why not?
No, sir, I do not. And I honestly believe that gun control is the remnants of the racism, the systemic racism that we hear about in America. I mean, think about the newly freed slaves. What did they do to them? They disarmed them. They made it certain that they couldn't defend themselves. So the bottom line is that gun control is racist. And today, the communities that are most impacted by violence, they need the proper education about firearms safety. They don't need to be disarmed.
And in your experience, ma'am, are firearms used as a deterrent for violent crimes that could result in serious injury or death?
Absolutely, and that's what that CDC study showed, and that's why it's no longer on their website, is because it doesn't support their narrative.
Right. Now, in regards to your experience as a law enforcement officer, ma'am, what effect on safety in local communities did defunding the police and the open border policies of the Biden administration have on public safety?
I think it was detrimental, and I think that that's why Americans flew to the gun stores, and we've had record sales. We're touting that the bipartisan bill has decreased crime. Well, I would submit that it was because we've had over 1 million gun sales a month for the past 4 years, and that there's an estimated 26 million first-time gun owners. So it's not that gun control is working. Maybe it's the opposite, that firearms do prevent crimes. Also, on the heels of defunding the police, Baltimore has hired police officers, and they have prosecuted criminals. That is how you maintain a safer community.
Now, Mr. McDermott, in regards to Chicago, there's been a lot of talk about this iron pipeline and so on and so forth, but their current mayor, Mr. Johnson, he campaigned as someone who was very hostile towards the police department. He was very progressive in his willingness to let positions go unfilled. What effect does local law enforcement backing the blue, enforcing existing laws have on gun violence in Chicago and other cities where violence is a problem?
Thank you. I believe Mr. Raskin indicated that Chicago is a place where there's been a lot of, the gun law strength has become much better. But if you ask the people of Chicago, they don't feel safer. They don't feel safer at all. As a matter of fact, they feel even more scared, especially when you're talking about things such as defunding the police. This gives rise to a great concern. A lot of people are, as I said, are going out purchasing firearms because they don't believe they can now feel that they have that type of protection there. So it's created a number of different situations that weren't created before. Something that hasn't been brought up, the number of people that are being charged after defending themselves is at an all-time high from my experience.
Yeah.
I don't know if there are any statistics on that, but from my experience, there's a tremendous number of people that are being charged that were never being charged before after defending themselves in Chicago.
I find it interesting that the other side of the aisle says we need to pass more laws. That will reduce gun violence, passing more laws, right?
Well, because
it's illegal to sell drugs, but what do people do? They sell drugs. It's illegal to commit assault, but what do people do? Commit assault. It's illegal to commit property crimes. What do they do? But they commit property crimes. But if we just pass more laws, the criminals who use firearms will obey them. That's the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely, that's the narrative. And obviously, that's not what's happening. We're seeing that we are disarming law-abiding citizens.
Is there a gun control measure that will not affect lawful, responsible gun owners, but will affect criminals?
Gentleman's time's expired. You may answer the question, Mr. McDermott.
I'm sorry, in what respect? You're saying, is there
a law that could be passed that will not punish law-abiding, responsible gun owners, but will prohibit criminals from breaking the law?
Not in this context, not at all.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. Yeah, I understand you have a UC.
Yeah, but I actually have a point of order first now. The witness.
Please state your point of order.
The witness just falsely identified something that he claimed I said. I'd never even mentioned the word Chicago. If we could change the record on that, or at least I'd like to clarify. He may have been thinking of something somebody else said, but I never mentioned Chicago.
We're going to let it stand. The record speaks for itself.
Okay, then I just want to state that that was completely false.
Thank you. Now, the chair,
I have a unanimous consent request to enter in the record an article from Benjamin Weiss titled "Dems Demand Details from Bondi on Trump's Directive to Review Gun Regulations," published by Courthouse News on March 3rd, 2025.
Without objection. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell.
Well, this hearing is...
Hold it. We've got a problem with the clock again.
I'll take as much time as I may consume.
I know I'm not giving you 10:34.
You don't want to give me 10:34.
So they're checking on it. So we're going to be in recess for another. Are we good? We good? Okay. All right. I need some help watching that clock. But now, Mr. Swalwell, please.
Well, this hearing is beautifully titled, "The Right to Self-Defense." I see some moms who are here who would like to talk about the right to self-defense, because a lot of moms lost their children in many of the mass shootings conducted with assault weapons over the last 10 years. So I would like to ask, what was the self-defense in Aurora where 12 people were killed? What was the self-defense in Newtown where 26 people were killed, most of them babies, little kids? What was the self-defense in Orlando? 49 people were killed. What was the self-defense in Vegas when 58 people were killed? What was the self-defense in Sutherland Springs? 26 people were killed. What was the self-defense at Parkland, where 17 people were killed, mostly students? What was the self-defense at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, where 11 people were killed? What was the self-defense in Thousand Oaks, where 12 people were killed? What was the self-defense in Gilroy, where 3 people were killed? What was the self-defense in El Paso, where 22 people were killed? What was the self-defense in Dayton, where 9 people were killed? Or Boulder, where 10 people were killed? Or the self-defense in Buffalo, where another 10 were killed? Or Uvalde, where 21 were killed, mostly babies, mostly little kids? Or Highland Park, not an assault rifle, or Charleston in a church, or Santa Fe? What was the self-defense? When most parents hear that there's a right to self-defense, they say, bullshit. My kids have a right to go home. My kids have a right to go home. I should be able to look them in the eye in the morning when I send them off to school and not have to think about what they're wearing, because I may have to identify them later. And that's what parents do right now. I know because they tell me. I know because I have 3 littles, 2 of them who are already doing mass shooter drills. I talked to a substitute teacher recently who told me that a student came up to her in her classroom and said, "Do you know where to put us?" And she was confused, and she said, "What are you talking about? Where do I put you?" And the student said, "You're not our normal teacher. Our normal teacher knows where to put us if somebody comes in here with a gun. Did they tell you where you're supposed to put us?" Those are the questions that our children are asking right now. Will you protect me? Do you think they feel protected by this hearing? By putting into our streets and our communities the most dangerous weapons so they can go into the hands of the most dangerous people? That doesn't protect anybody. Mr. Jackson, I wanted to ask you, and thank you for your work. Can you think of a legitimate purpose for an untraceable, unregistered gun?
No.
So would you agree that the only reason you need a what's called ghost gun is because you're a prohibited purchaser and you can't get one any other way, or you intend to commit a crime and you don't want people knowing where the gun came from?
Exactly.
I'd like unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to enter into the record a California Department of Justice report on California's fight against ghost guns.
Without objection.
Mr. Jackson, can you talk about some of the preparations and trainings and studies you and your office had done around mass shootings and what we can do to not traumatize our kids, because I think there is trauma associated with having to go through some of these drills, but to also not leave them unprepared if that ever came to their classroom?
Yeah, I mean, we looked pretty intensely at how guns are impacting our schools and frankly, what steps have been taken. And one thing that was clear is that the biggest threat are guns that are coming from the home. 76% of school shootings come from the home, and not just some boogeyman in the alley. But the real work that needs to be done is engaging parents to be more responsible and securing and storing their firearms to help prevent these tragedies.
That's not taking anyone's gun. That's just saying there's things you can do to lock it up and keep it safe. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Jordan.
Yeah, I was just going to make a point. Earlier, one of our Democrat colleagues talked about Kash Patel running the ATF. What I will say is this. When the ATF was run by someone else, I know some of the crazy things that happened. Any of you ever heard of Brian Malinowski? What happened to Mr. Malinowski? They said that he had somehow sold, was accused of selling 6 firearms that he wasn't supposed to sell. Instead of going, and they had a search warrant, instead of going there to Brian Malinowski while he worked, highest paid municipal employee in Little Rock, Arkansas, worked at the Bill and Hillary Clinton Airport. Instead of going to the airport and talking to him, going to his house, and then doing the search warrant, they decided they were going to do a pre-dawn raid. And they were all set to do it on one particular Friday, and then they found out he wasn't home. So they called it off, and they said, we're going to wait till the next Friday when he is home and go at, again, pre-dawn raid, 10 cars pull up, ATF agents and local police. They go up. The first thing you see from the doorbell cam is them putting the tape on the doorbell camera, and then 53 seconds later, Brian Malinowski is shot in the head because he does what any normal person would do. It's why what Mr. Kiley brought up about the crazy law they're proposing in California. He was defending himself. He thought he was getting robbed. Defended himself, gets shot in the head, and dies several hours later. That's the ATF before. So you can criticize Kash Patel. That's ridiculous. Thank goodness he is running the ATF. We don't have the same people who ran it when that happened to Mr. Mountain. Made no sense. 53 seconds. Why not just execute the search warrant like you should? Why not talk to him? Why not pick him up at the airport, Mr. Malinowski, we're going to your house. Call your wife, let him know where we're coming. We'll go there. We'll execute the search warrant. No, they couldn't do it that way. So I think the good Lord, Kash Patel is running the FBI and, frankly, interim director of the ATF. I don't know if you guys want to, Ms. Miller, you can say something, or Mr. McDermott, I'll let you guys say something if you want, but I thought.
Amen.
Amen. God bless you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I'll yield the rest of my, I appreciate you, the witnesses here today. Appreciate the chairman, the good work he does. I yield the rest of my time to the chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ritter, Are knives included in the definition of arms under the Second Amendment?
Certainly, they have been considered arms for millennia, perhaps man's oldest.
Is there any cases, Supreme Court or other federal cases that shed light on how knives are protected under the Second Amendment?
Certainly, both Heller and Brune bring up the subject of knives as arms, and they are certainly protected by the Second Amendment.
Under the COPA, Knife Owners Protection Act, the purpose of that is allow someone to move from state to state, and while they're actually in transit, they don't have access to their knives. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so that's why there's been bipartisan support. Generally, they don't have access to those knives, but they also shouldn't be prosecuted for transporting their knives across state lines.
That is correct. I mean, the reason we get bipartisan support is because the bills that we propose are all about criminal justice reform and people not being stopped simply because they're carrying a knife with no criminal intent whatsoever.
And in COPA, there's a provision dealing with private right of action. Why is that so important to the bill?
Private right of action is very important to COPA because COPA is closely related to the Firearms Owners Protection Act. In fact, it was originally based on that. And unfortunately, the Second Circuit in Taraco versus Port Authority determined that those sorts of claims do not give rise to a private right of action. So in some of the states where folks are most in danger of being prosecuted for having an illegal knife, even if they were to follow the lock them up according to COPA, there's a precedent that they have no right of action, and without a right of action, there's very little deterrence for rogue law enforcement or prosecutors to go after them, despite what Congress's intent may be.
Thank you. With that, the time, I'm going to yield it back to Mr. Jordan, who's gone, and so the time has expired. And now I recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Laurel Lee. I'm sorry, Florida. I'm sorry. What did I say?
California.
Oh, gracious.
Uh-oh.
Understandable mistake, Mr. Chairman. I will yield my time to the chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Mueller, are people who want to restrict Second Amendment rights supportive of women's rights?
Negative.
How so?
Well, like I mentioned in my opener, that we are smaller and less equipped for violence, and that is why women are the fastest growing demographic of gun owners. It levels the playing field, and if anybody thinks that they don't need a firearm or chooses not to have a firearm, that's their choice, but they're going to do so from a place of privilege because they may have security or they may live in a community that doesn't necessarily need to have security, but not all of us can afford to have our own security. Therefore, we have to take it in our own hands. And I know mothers that refuse to outsource the security of their children. And like Mr. Swalwell said, school shootings and all of those shootings that you mentioned, I was trying to keep up with you, but I was thinking gun-free zone, gun-free zone, gun-free zone, gun-free zone. Obviously, gun-free zones do not work. They're dangerous, they're deadly, and we can protect our children, and we can not traumatize our children. There's a program called Faster Saves Lives, and I would love to discuss that with you.
Thank you. And Mr. McDermott, should law enforcement officers be allowed to carry a firearm in gun-free school zones or on public transportation?
Absolutely.
And would you?
I'm sorry. I was just gonna further along those lines.
I'm going to get back to that in a second.
Go ahead.
There's two questions I really want to get here. Okay, yeah, Ms. Mueller. Okay, would you have liked the option to purchase your service weapon? Right, when you retired as a police officer.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, Mr. McDermott, I saw you writing furiously when my colleague from California was iterating various shootings, and I wondered what in the devil were you writing, and what would be your response?
All right. loaded question, no pun intended, but I just, when Mr. Swallow was indicating, kept on asking, was it self-defense here, was it self-defense here, was it self-defense here? It just kept hitting me a particular way. If there had been some form of self-defense, if somebody had been able to defend themselves in those particular areas, if somebody had actually done so, we wouldn't have been naming off these higher numbers. Instead, as to Ms. Muller's point, and what I stand by myself, is we have all these different gun-free zones, which is basically a fallacy. They do nothing to make our communities safer. They basically leave the good defenseless against criminals, law-abiding citizens defenseless against criminals, and they take advantage of it. They take full advantage of it.
How difficult is it for someone traveling across state lines to know what the self-defense laws are in each state?
It's incredibly difficult. And I'll tell you, when I said at the very beginning, I've lectured in front of thousands of people now. One of the very first questions I ask after defining whether people in the room know what it is to be able to use lethal force and when you're entitled to use lethal force to defend yourself, one of the very first questions I ask in these different jurisdictions is who in the room knows which type of jurisdiction they reside in. Very often, people are confused. Very often, in certain states, which are very anti-firearm, which are very anti-police, many people believe in those jurisdictions that they're automatically a duty retreat, and that's also something that's argued by prosecutors in these particular states. Even if they have stand your ground law, your client or this defendant could have actually retreated, could have gotten to a safer place. The reason that this client, she's being charged, is because she discharged her firearm, because she shot this person, and that's not why. That's not appropriate. It's not proper. It's not even correct, and it continues to happen.
So looking at ATF, what actions do you think ATF under President Trump need to be prioritized?
What actions under the ATF? I mean, that's a loaded question. I think that we need to stop first and foremost, we need to stop attacking law-abiding citizens with respect to their ownership of firearms. We need to recognize that people have a right to defend themselves. We need to recognize that we are not in a position, nobody's in a position to tell people how they can and can't defend themselves. In that respect, we have to stop, with this campaign to continuously collect firearms from law-abiding citizens. You need to do a bit more research into this, and you need to make sure that we're not crossing lines in those particular times.
Ms. Mueller, same question.
Well, I don't know about the ATF specifically, but I'll address the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. I actually wanted to rename that to the Office of Violence Prevention because we're all against violence. Guns are inanimate objects, and they're not violent in and of themselves. And I think that, Mira O'Connell, who was the one who defended herself from the serial rapist and took his gun, that is the exact opportunity for a gun to be used for good, in good hands, and for bad hands. So I would like to keep that office and use it for firearms education and actual studying.
Thank you. Mr. Swallow.
A unanimous consent request for a June 27, 2024 NBC News story about a former Uvalde district chief charged with child endangerment when he had a gun and 21 kids were killed because he didn't use it. Also, a Texas Tribune, July 8, 2016 story, police use of robot to kill Dallas suspect unprecedented because 5 Dallas officers died while armed officers were not able to take down the shooter.
Without objection. Thank you. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Moskowitz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McDermott, I want to tell you a quick story about my experience in my community. So I come from a city called Parkland. I graduated Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. And in 2018, I was on the House floor at the time, and my wife texted me, and she said, I just drove past Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, and I've never seen that many police in my lifetime. I wound up turning on the news and finding out that a troubled young man had walked into Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and killed 17 people. A kid that the school board knew was a problem and didn't do anything about, had given him chance after chance after chance. Police had been to his house. The FBI had gotten hits on him, didn't follow up. This has resulted in lawsuits and settlements. But he walked into that school and he killed 17 people. He walked right past the security monitor, a person on a golf cart with a walkie-talkie, saw him, okay, didn't radio. He went floor to floor. He started on the first floor. He started killing people in the hallway. He never entered a classroom. He just put his gun up to the glass of every door and just fired through the little glass window that these classrooms had, killing all sorts of kids and adults. We had adults run into the building to try to help kids. They were killed as a result of this. And the guy they depended on, the students depended on, the SRO, right? Did he respond? He didn't. He stayed outside the building like a coward. He never went into the building. When the police department showed up, by the way, everyone was dead by the time they got there. But when the police department showed up, do you know what the SRO on scene told those police departments? Don't go in. He instructed, because he's the incident commander on scene, he instructed them not to go in. 2 different police departments. Eventually, Coral Springs, the local police department, decided to go in. The sheriff of the Broward County Sheriff's Office, okay, was removed by Governor DeSantis over this. The superintendent lost his job in Broward County over this. And so, what did Florida do? Florida, Republican Florida, run by the House, Republicans in the House, in the Senate, Republican governor, now a U.S. Senator, the whole Republican cabinet. The gunshine state. What did they do? Well, they passed the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School Safety Act. And you know what that did? It did a bunch of things. It raised the age to buy a gun to 21. Not possession. Parents could still buy their kids a gun, but it raised the age to buy a gun to 21. It instituted 3-day waiting periods, red flag laws. It also, by the way, created the Guardian program, which allowed non-classroom teachers to go through training. And as a result, there would be additional guns on school campus. Folks that went through training with the sheriff's office. They made it a local option so that counties could decide if they wanted to do that. By the way, almost every single county opted into the program, okay? And the program's been a success. It's actually been a success. It was a comprehensive bill. It did all things. It looked at the problem and said, what is the issue? We can't just wait for the police departments to get there, because sometimes by the time they get there, everyone's dead. Well, we can't just depend on the SRO, because sometimes these guys don't do the right thing. We also got to recognize that there are a lot of troubled people out there with mental health. So we put hundreds of millions of dollars into mental health. But we also wanted to make sure that young people, if they wanted to go hunting with their father or their parents, they could do that. Right? The dad could take them, or the mom could take them, could buy their gun. But we didn't want an 18-year-old walking into a gun store like this kid did and come out with an AR-15, unlimited ammunition, body armor. This guy, as the kids were fleeing out the building, tried to pick children off as they were running out of the building. You know why he didn't succeed? The hurricane glass. We got lucky. Hurricane glass, which was put in the building to stop hurricanes, actually stopped the trajectory of the bullets, took a lot of the speed out of the bullets away, so they just fell on the ground, didn't kill anyone. I would tell you that Florida is one of the most gun-friendly states in America. Has been for the longest time. Marion Hammer, the head of the NRA, was the main lobbyist there, right? Stand your ground, born and bred in Florida, okay? But I give my Republican colleagues credit. They saw what was happening. They saw an epidemic. And they don't want to take people's guns away. They're Second Amendment right advocates through and through. But they did the right thing because there is a balance. This idea that there is no balance, I reject. And Florida proved that absolutely wrong. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now yield myself for 5 minutes. So the first thing I want to cover, and I appreciate Mr. Jackson, I appreciate you being here and your testimony today. So as I listened to your testimony talking about post the all-time highs, I guess, of murders that took place during the COVID-19 era, I began thinking, I wonder what other independent variables went in that. Was there retrograde analysis done in that study, if there's been a study done at all? And were any of those other independent variables isolated? And I would suggest to you that actually in your testimony and other people's testimonies today, we know that there was a spike. It happened during COVID-19. What caused the spike? Some people say it was COVID-19 that caused the spike. The people frustrated, people sick, people out, people isolated. All of that took place. But we also know that once that went away, I mean, I don't know that you can attribute it all necessarily to the legislation that I think my colleagues have. You actually changed the society, began trying to get back to normal. And that's why you see the spike. You see this certain level, it's kind of moving like that on the graph line that was there. Then you have the spike, and then it starts winding its way back down. You don't know what we don't know what the dependent variables are or the independent variables are as we look at that as a study, if we're going to look at it as a study. And that's why it's so important in my mind that you really actually kind of isolate those variables and you do the regressive analysis to see what's there. So that's just where I am and to start with. And so I want to go now to Ms. Mueller. Ms. Mueller, what are some of the potential negative consequences of a jurisdiction that fails to grant an individual's application for a concealed carry permit?
Are you referring to shall issue and may issue?
Yes, I am. I was going to get that from Mr. McDermott, but I'm here with you, so you go ahead.
Well, I think that anytime you throw a barrier up between, let's say, a woman who's facing domestic violence, and anytime you throw a barrier to her being able to defend herself, is going to be detrimental. We hear it time after time. I know there was a woman in New Jersey that was waiting for her concealed carry permit. She was stabbed, I believe, in her driveway. The criminals don't wait, and if you need to defend yourself now, then you're only creating a barrier for people to be safe.
And Ms. Mueller, you were a law enforcement officer for 22 years in Tulsa, right?
Yes, sir.
And so you encountered stressful situations as a law enforcement officer, right?
Yes, sir.
And did you ever encounter somebody who was a violent criminal?
Yes, sir.
And what is the stress level when you encounter somebody that is threatening, violent?
On a scale of 1 to 10?
Yeah.
I'm going to go 8 to 10.
Yeah, and you know, we really need to keep that in mind as we talk about these things too. And so, Mr. McDermott, I want to talk to you. What's the difference between those may issue and shall issue jurisdictions with respect to the concealed carry permits?
Well, obviously, that was addressed in Bruin, just the significance of may issue and the discretion that extends to the government, to local police sometimes, like in Illinois, it's ISP that makes a determination. And the fact that it shouldn't, it's often abused, and it certainly violates our Second Amendment. There are states such as Illinois that are considered shall issue states, and because of that and because of the ruling, there's, in my opinion, there's a misconception with respect to the fact that Bruin doesn't actually apply to Illinois. Illinois is a state which is shall issue. However, it has, when you look at the Concealed Carry Act, it has approximately 20 plus different ways in which they can go ahead and deny firearms to people. It's very discretionary. You can't get in touch with anybody. When you call to ask, you're never given a name. There's never a direct line. There's not an office that you can speak to somebody. It's basically an eyes behind the curtain type of situation. Somebody's deciding who gets the firearms, who doesn't. I know somebody that was arrested for having a FOID revoked. His FOID was revoked, his firearm owner's identification card, which is what's required in Illinois, for example. His FOID was revoked because he was charged with a felony. The prosecutor later reduced it down to a misdemeanor because the evidence didn't support the felony. He took a plea for supervision on a misdemeanor, which he would have never had his FOID lost as a result of. He later, because he didn't know that it was permanently revoked, was arrested and charged with having a revoked FOID, which is mandatory jail time or prison time in the state of Illinois. So it's being abused consistently. These may issue jurisdictions shouldn't exist, and that's what Bruin stands for.
Thank you. I thank all of the witnesses and everyone who's attended this hearing. This concludes today's hearing. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.